Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Meltzer Hellrung's October webinar, Immigration Budgeting and H-1B Modernization Rule. We will get started here in about 2 minutes. Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome everyone to Meltzer Hellrung's October webinar, Immigration Budgeting and H-1B Modernization. Happy Halloween to everyone. Just a couple preliminary statements here before we get started. We will be covering immigration budgeting in general today, as well as the new H-1B modernization rule that was released about a week and a half ago. The webinar today is for information purposes only and should not be considered legal advice. We've set aside about 1 hour today to get through the material. We do have quite a few slides, so we're going to move quickly. If you have a question, please feel free to type it into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen in your toolbar. We will try to get to those questions as much as possible and follow up thereafter if we cannot via email. The webinar.
Just add that if you do not show up anonymously and we post a question, we will make sure we follow up with you after the presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Matt.
That's your question.
The webinar today is recorded. So in the deck, we will be providing both the recording and the deck in a follow-up email to all registrants of today's webinar. So we're going to go get started. A little bit introduction about ourselves. Meltzer Hellrung was founded in 2014. We leverage technology, a service-oriented mindset, and a compassionate approach to assisting high-growth corporations in scaling their immigration programs, increasing access to talent, and expanding operations into new global markets. We have about 200 corporate clients and file about 3,000 matters a year. And a cross-section of our book of business looks a little bit like venture-backed high-growth unicorns in EdTech, FinTech, and SaaS, as well as Fortune 500 companies in insurance, transportation, and manufacturing. And most recently, we were recognized in 2023 by Crane Magazine of Chicago as the top 100 best places to work. We're very proud of that. About a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago now, we released a proprietary immigration management platform to improve the experience that clients were having with both our firm and immigration as a whole. We call that brand that platform Voyager. Here's a screenshot you can see. This is a dashboard that an HR or people ops person would log into. On the left-hand side, you have a navigation tab. You can see the cases and actions that you've most recently accessed, as well as tasks that are assigned to you. And you can access your entire immigration program through this platform, all your employees, all the cases at any given time. Some of the benefits of Voyager specifically, it's an immigration management platform we've designed to provide a seamless immigration experience for employers and employees and their families. The platform was created for our clients and their employees and is used by our exceptionally skilled legal team internally. And the main drivers of Voyager, or the value propositions, are to drive efficiency, transparency, and information accessibility throughout the immigration process for companies, employees, and their families. We provide transparency throughout all immigration processes via a customized workflow for each type of immigration case that we handle. The workflows are designed to be really efficient, to bring in the information and documents that we need while cutting down on time required to provide those. We offer lifetime storage of immigration and data in the platform. All the petitions, all the approval notices, everything that we've ever worked on for your business and your employees will always be located there. We've taken quite a bit of time to design the interface to be intuitive, both to employers, employees, and their families. And we're very proud of the comprehensive knowledge center that we have in the platform that provides dozens of different pieces of collateral for HRs, for employees when you're traveling. A little bit about ourselves today. As you heard me speaking, my name is Matthew Helra. I am co-founder and managing partner. I specialize in scaling immigration programs for our high growth clients and creating immigration policy and training. And with me today is my law partner and business partner, Matthew Meltzer. Matt?
Good afternoon, good morning, depending where you are, and thanks for joining us. I'm Matt Meltzer. I'm one of the other partners here at the firm. I do a little bit of everything, but I often work with companies entering the U.S. market and building strategies for those companies and entrepreneurs.
Thanks, Matt. A little bit about our agenda today. So as you can see, we're moving a little more quickly through the introduction because we've got a lot to cover. This webinar was originally going to be based around immigration budgeting, and lo and behold, the Department of Homeland Security decided to drop an H-1B modernization rule out of the blue. So we're going to take a bit of time for both today, as we know that most folks are concerned with budgeting, but also how is this new rule going to affect their budget for next year. Well, first, we're going to cover some of the prerequisite information that's required for immigration budgeting. You do have to pull together certain things that you're going to need in order to use to create an immigration budget effectively and accurately. We'll talk about non-immigrant work visa expenses, legal fees, filing fees, things that you should consider when you're creating your budget. Green card expenses are always a little bit more expensive than non-immigrant work visas. And if you have a green card program, we definitely want to include that in the budget. That may be some or most of your spend. And then we'll talk about internal and external change factors, both what's happening in your business internally that may affect your immigration spend, and then certainly externally. There's lots of stuff going on with the government, with the economy in general that may affect your immigration spend. Thereafter, we're going to move to the H-1B modernization rule. It was dropped about a week and a half ago. This is a proposed rule at this point, but we have on good word that USCIS will likely want to implement this by the lottery next year. So it's coming up pretty quickly. We'll talk about the modernizations and efficiencies, as well as several other components in there. At this point, I'm going to hand it off to Matt Meltzer. You want to go ahead and talk about budgeting?
Thanks, Matt. So in terms of budgeting, there are always multiple components, and I think it's always helpful to think about where budget lies in your company and how budgeting occurs. Different companies, immigration budget can go different places. We have some clients where our budget is in the HR or people ops department. Sometimes the immigration budget goes directly to the various teams and departments within a company. And so the question is, are costs being borne by the HR team? Are they being borne by where the employee works internally? So that will, of course, change exactly how you're forecasting budget. But clearly, we know that for many companies, budgets are really, really tight right now. And everyone is trying to figure out exactly what they're going to spend, how they're going to contain costs. And so budgeting, to me, goes together hand in hand with policy. It is a good time to think not just what are you spending, but why are you spending? And so first, do you even have an immigration policy? Second, if you do have one, is it time to reapproach your policy and think about any changes that you want to input and how that will impact a budget as well? Keep in mind that immigration policy can be changed differently for your existing employees versus future employees. You could grandfather people in, you could change it across the board, but I think that's really important to think about.
Matt, I've seen so many policies that we've had for clients that we've taken that don't even address the idea of cost of the immigration program and how closely that is connected to your program or policy. So I think it's a great point.
Yeah. For our clients, we love participating in these processes. We think that building a budget and a policy is really integral and critical to having not just a well-operating immigration program, but helping companies, accurately project the value of having our national employees and what they're willing to bear. And this helps on so many levels make your program more efficient, make your program easier to operate at scale. you probably don't need a policy for having 1 or 2 foreign national employees, but if you have 10 or more, I would say that's a place where it really makes sense to think about investing in a policy. So in terms of information you're going to want to gather, either on your own or whether through with counsel, if you're one of our clients, hopefully we've done this for you already or are working on it. Who are your employees that you are sponsoring or you will need to sponsor? It's really important to try to also understand people that you aren't sponsoring but are also foreign nationals. So that's people on DACA, TPS, H4 EADs, or other kinds of EADs. It's really important to know those people exist, because as policies change, like for DACA, which could be impacted, you may want to think, should we sponsor this person? And should that person be brought into our projected budget? And then you're going to look at what is needing to be done, who's going into the lottery, what expirations are coming up. Do you know what your legal fees for each of these are? Do you know what the filing fees for these applications are? And then the piece that is harder is who are you going to hire? And what are your typical rates of having foreign national employees in those roles? From some of our clients, if they're hiring software developers, they know that potentially like 10% of those are going to need sponsorship. If you're hiring in, graphic design, you might say, we're going to need no one. We never sponsor in those roles. So it's important to know what your hiring is. And the other piece is also a really good financial planning takes account of what you think turnover will be. And how many of the people who you currently have in visas may not make it through the year or may not need these extensions. Clearly, if you have 500 foreign national employees, it probably makes sense that maybe 50 of them are going to drop off. So that's a really important secondary piece to take into account. In terms of the next piece is thinking about what your green card sponsorship is. When do you start green card sponsorship, specifically perms? Is it based on length of employment, time on H-1B, based on max out date? That is going to really have a very significant impact on your budgeting. And then other things that might impact your budget are needing to file amendments based on when an employee is changing roles or more likely changing location. So if you have employees who have remote work possibility and they're allowed to move around the country, how many times might you need to sponsor an H-1B if someone's moving from New York to Miami or from LA to Denver? And similarly, if you have people working at client sites, how long are your contracts? How many times a year will people need to move around?
From a policy or budgeting perspective there, I think I want to tie that back to policy as well. As what is your policy on allowing employees to move different work locations or home locations that may require amendments? Are you allowing it once a year? Are you never allowing that? That type of policy creation or policy aspect will definitely affect your budget in terms of amendments, in addition to green cards and many other areas.
Yeah. And then, of course, similarly, we talk about hiring. There's also questions about layoffs. What is the projected budget going to do in terms of headcount in the next year? Are you going to have layoffs? What does that mean potentially for your staff? And then, there's really a question of what costs are borne by who. Within the world of immigration fees, there are things that a company must pay for, and then there are things that the company can choose to pay for or not pay for, and ask foreign national employees to pay for. That's a really important thing to take into your budgeting as well. So thinking more about non-immigrant visas, which are temporary visas, work authorized visas, the things that go into it are the legal fees, your filing fees, dependents. So if you have H-1B employees, they're H-4 dependents, they're L-1 employees, they're L-2 spouses. What is going to go into that and who is paying for what? And then similarly, as we talked about before, the individuals who aren't sponsored by the company, but are here on some other immigration basis. What are you extending any benefits to them? Do you need to move any of them to some kind of sponsorship status, whether that's a green card, an H-1B, or other?
Matt, when we take on clients, we want to know every single employee that is receiving or on an immigration benefit inside a corporation. You would say, well, why do we really have to track H-4, L-2s, or E-3 spouses, or DACA, or TPS? because if these individuals' work authorizations end, you as a business are not going to be able to fill that position, or they're going to have to leave their role, or they maybe have to go on leave for some period of time. So it's important that the business understand exactly who is on an immigration benefit, whether it's sponsored by the business or sponsored by a spouse or some other humanitarian or TPS role. And what do you as a business want to do in terms of exerting control over that person's work authorization? If we track it, then we can help file it or pay for the extension to make sure that individual continuously has work authorization for the business throughout the year.
Yeah, and some businesses struggle to locate these people, but clients of ours often will have processes built in with their I-9 to try to locate these people after they're on board, because they're not checking a box saying they need sponsorship, but nonetheless they are still our national employees. And it's really important, for I-9 purposes to know that when they're going to need to be, you're going to have to re-verify I-9s, but also to be really tracking these issues, to be aware of, when people might have issues popping up. So the next piece is about lottery sponsorship. Again, who are you sponsoring? What and how is the lottery changing and affecting your desire to submit? This past year, the lottery was admittedly a mess. 740,000, I believe, was the number of applications into the lottery. It's just a radically high jump. That jump was based on a lot of foreign nationals being sponsored by multiple employers. So employers working together to coordinate to submit the same group of individuals across multiple companies.
In fact, Matt, I think the statistic was about half of the lottery entries were duplicates or employees that were submitted multiple times by different employers.
Right. So the government's proposal, which we'll be going over later in this webinar, is talking about changing it to an employee-centric. So as opposed to getting lottery selections based on the job submission, rather based on an individual. So if an individual does have multiple employers submit into the lottery, they'll still only have one chance at selection, and then that employee will be able to choose which employer actually is going to go forward with a lottery submission. So hopefully that gamesmanship will make the lottery much more palatable to U.S. employers, will incentivize people coming back, because employers have rightfully said if this is the chances of being selected in the lottery, you may not want to participate.
And Matt, I want to double back on the point you made earlier. The best way to track who's on an immigration benefit inside your organization is catching it at the I-9 stage. What documents is the employee presenting that authorize their identity and their ability to work for your organization? That is the point in which every business has the opportunity to start collecting what immigration benefits everyone is on. I see this every single year as we talk about the H-1B lottery. All of a sudden, a few days before the cap opens, or perhaps during the cap, an F1 student raises their hand and says, I need H-1B lottery sponsorship, and businesses are scrambling around to get the information necessary to submit. It happens all the time. It's somewhat, I would say, unavoidable, but that I-9 verification is the best way for you as an organization to learn who's on an immigration benefit, and then communicate that to us as your provider. We'll open up a profile in Voyager for the individual and start tracking their information, so that when the lottery comes around every year, it's not a mole hunt or looking for a needle in a haystack of who needs sponsorship. We already know those individuals, and have a better opportunity to then project budget for those individuals, year after year.
Thanks, Matt. Similarly, we're thinking about employees who are not necessarily in the U.S. but have U.S. visas, whether that's a visitor visa or a work authorized visa, something like an L1 or an E2, where maybe they make frequent trips to the U.S. but they're not on U.S. payroll. What will you be incurring as expenses for that? And I would just note here that while this presentation is U.S. based, depending on where global immigration costs lie, it may make sense to go through these exercises for your visas globally. For some of our clients, the U.S. handles immigration centrally for the entire globe. Some places, the immigration function is office by office. But if there is any centralization, it does certainly make sense to look at this on a global perspective and not just a U.S. one. All right, green card expenses. These will undoubtedly be some of your larger expenses for your company. Again, going back to policy, who are you sponsoring? When are you sponsoring? And then what kind of green cards are you sponsoring? Perms, if you are a company that has traditionally waited late to file perms, 2 years from max out date, that needs to be changed. The perm processing times have gone wildly out of control. You really need to make sure you're starting green card processes at least 3 years before someone has a max out date. And then thinking about your other green card options that may not be quite as time sensitive, your EB1s, your NIWs, EB2 Schedule A's. This will depend on your company and the kind of people being sponsored, but it makes sense to work with us or your council to look at your entire foreign national population and profiles to think about who needs a perm, who might fall into other categories, and what is the approach you're going to be taking. That will certainly dictate timeline. And then, from the perm perspective, you're looking at legal fees, you're looking at filing fees, looking at advertising expenses in the perm process. And then at the end, also, are you, who is sponsoring the adjustment of status, who pays for that, who pays for family members. So those are all different parts. And depending on your company, if you are able to batch green cards together, your advertising fees certainly might drop as you're might be able to sponsor multiple people in one green card process.
Now, I want to take a moment here and just launch a quick poll that we have: is who has completed their immigration budgeting for 2024? Some companies are doing it early and earlier every single year. We have clients that are completing immigration budgets, I think, as early as September now, depending on their fiscal year. Just a moment here. It's about enough. So we got about 70% of folks have not completed immigration budgeting yet. We have 30%. My hat's off to the 30% that do. Typically a procrastinator when it comes to budgeting. So congratulations, you're ahead of the game. For everyone else, hopefully this is insightful. Matt, go ahead.
Thanks. Coming next to the additional parts of the perm process, I would say that adjustment of status is one of the hardest parts to project, because the question is who is going to be eligible for adjustment. If you have large populations of individuals who are born in India or China, projecting this is definitely more art than science, given questions about how far priority dates might progress in any given year. And there's no absolutely good policy. And we're seeing that even EB2 and EB3 for people not born in India or China are retrogressed right now. So projecting this, I generally take the approach of saying, we'll assume that the priority dates move 1 year in a fiscal year. That's probably
it's a fair assumption, man.
Right? Probably a little bit optimistic, but I think if you go that way, you probably won't be overcompensating in terms of what how much you're looking to spend.
And so one of the biggest misses I see with clients that we take on is you may have filed or started a perm in 2022, but you have advertising fees that will be due in 2023, or I-140 immigrant fees and legal fees that we do in 2023 or 2024. So trying to understand where are your green cards in process, if you have like 10, 20, 30, or 40 of them, and what fees will hit at what time throughout the fiscal year of 2024, whatever that is for your business.
All right. Let's talk about change factors. What's going to potentially, make you look at things a little differently. Will there be any significant policy changes that affect immigration spend? That will certainly be coming up shortly. We'll be talking a lot about what's happening in the H-1B world. But some of these things are in your company's control. They're not just about what will happen from the USCIS or other agencies. Are you implementing or changing any new policies? Are you being more favorable or less favorable in terms of certain benefits? That's going to affect your cost a lot. Headcount increase, decrease. If you're in a growth phase, projecting what percentage of new hires might need immigration sponsorship is really important. If you're in a place where you might be projecting reductions in force, similarly, what does that mean on immigration spend? It's also really important if you're looking at reduction in force, thinking about what those roles are, because it may not just impact those employees and what you're spending on them. It may impact what your green card spend is as well, because reductions in force can have a significant impact on perm programs and when you can sponsor. Generally, you can't hard to submit perms for similar roles within 6 months of a layoff. And so that's something to think about in terms of your timing and what that's going to mean for spend as well. And then, of course, there are pieces here about M&A or divestiture, whether you're spinning off a company, you're looking to acquire a company, thinking about what that might mean here as well.
Man, two things I'd like to point out here. A lot of companies will just blindly use premium processing, which is now $2,500 per case across their entire application sort of stream. One place that we've saved clients a lot of money, and we've just seen excess spend when it's not necessary, is using premium processing for everything. The approach should be, when is speed of the essence for us as a business? When does it make the biggest ROI for us? From our guidance, or in our opinion, it's really when you're filing those transfer cases, when you have H-1B transfers, E-3 transfers, TN transfers, those non-immigrant work visa transfers. Premium processing really is of the essence, because you want to get someone in the seat as soon as possible, and you don't want to wait 3 to 6 months for an approval to have the person on board. So that's an excess spend that we often see in a lot of clients' programs that can quickly be drawn in to lower the overall cost of immigration, but use premium processing strategically when it's at the best interest of the business to do so. And one other area I'd like to highlight that often businesses do not consider is when you have an office closure. Office closures can significantly affect perm programs, and you may have to, in some cases, if it's not thought of ahead of time by client and immigration partner, redo a significant amount of perms or green cards that have to be done because of how they were filed. So we've several times taken on clients where they've had office closures, and that's required a significant amount of reinvestment into their green card program as a result. And that was never actually considered when the business was doing an operational calculation of the cost benefit of the office closure itself.
Great point, Matt. External factors. Government filing fees. It's important to note that earlier in 2023, the USCIS proposed a regulatory rule that would change filing fees going forward. That's been under review for over 6 months now. So in terms of when that might take effect, who knows, but it's certainly plausible it will take effect next year. It's something that to consider in budgeting. Whether those proposed fees will be the exact numbers that show up at the end of the final rule is impossible to know, but you could work on those based on what the proposals are. Any significant changes in immigration policy, we'll be talking more about that later, and whether that's going to impact your own strategy, whether it's how are you going to participate in the lottery differently. I think for IT staffing and consulting companies, that's really an area that's going to be probably the most important. We're going to talk more about what the new rules are, but basically we're looking back to the pre-2020 days of having more documentation from the end client and needing to amend petitions whenever there's a movement, not just whether it's in a different metropolitan statistical area. And so that's something to take into account in terms of how your company places employees. And then of course the macroeconomic pieces that might be more particular to different companies, but what is your company? Is your company changing how it hires? If you are hiring, are you looking to, what year are you looking to in terms of what percentage of your roles are filled by foreign workers? We've certainly seen on our clients that with large layoffs at places like Amazon and Google and Meta, that more of their tech roles are being filled by people with work authorization as opposed to people who need sponsorship. So are you looking to your 2023 numbers? Are you looking to your 2019 numbers? Those will definitely change what you think about as you project spend. And then of course, other things in the macroeconomic area. Does your company, especially large companies, have any sort of benchmarks about what things like inflation and other numbers do to how your company operates and projecting an ability to hire or not?
Yeah, and before we switch gears here, Matt, I've got a question. It says my office is in a single location, have about half a dozen or so H-1B employees. Lease is up in a couple of years. May move to a building likely less than 20 miles away. Does this require amendment of immigration documents? For H-1Bs, probably not. Probably not for perms or green cards either, because the biggest thing is when you have an office closure and office move is it within the same metropolitan statistical area? If you're just moving down the street or 10 or 20 miles away, that's very likely going to be in the same metropolitan statistical area, which means you don't have to refile LCAs or H-1B amendments because the employees are staying within that area. Likely green cards would have to be refiled either because you're in the same metro area again. It's really when you have an office closure. And then like we had for example, client that had an office closure in Houston and then moved their entire office operations like out of state someplace like that. That is a more significant change that would require likely amendments in H-1Bs, but also perms in that case. And again, it's important to consider the repercussions of office closures or office moves as we are in the post-pandemic era, and a lot of businesses are looking at what they're going to be doing with their office space in the next few years, as many do not have the volume of employees coming into the office every day, and therefore looking to save costs by shrinking their office footprint.
One thing we did not mention before we go on to H-1B modernization is everything here was focused on cost and what you might do to save costs or not in terms of what you spend or don't spend. One thing just to be aware of is where do credits that might actually be valuable go as well. And so for those of you who are unaware, individuals who are on F1, J1, and Q1 visas, depending on when they entered the US, may not be subject to FICA and FUTA taxes. And that is both on the employee side and the employer side. So if an individual is here in F1, J1 in the first 5 years, they are not subject to those FICA and FUTA taxes. So from a company, if you are have someone who typically it's someone who completed a master's degree and didn't do a bachelor's degree in the US, that oftentimes the first 2 to 3 years of employment are FICA tax free. And at 7.6%, if you have someone who's paid $100,000, that's $7,650 a year in savings. So I think it's important in your budget when you are especially presenting to other higher ups, if you have those people who are creating savings that can potentially offset other immigration expenses, it's really important to take that into account. It can help you advocate for your budget because those employees are saving costs that other US workers would otherwise have. So I think that's a really important thing to do for advocacy when you're looking for budget.
Yeah, and on the flip side of that, I would say if you have F1, J1, or Q1 employees and you are withholding FUTA and FICA taxes from there and paying for the government or local state governments for it, or federal government, forgive me in this case, I would go individual by individual and ask, when is the first year that you've entered the United States? And you could potentially be withholding or paying taxes that aren't required. And therefore, reduce that cost of the employee. And as Matt said, credit that forward to the immigration costs that you may incur later on with the H-1B lottery and green cards. It's always important to count credits, as Matt said, versus just cost. So now we're going to move on to the H-1B modernization rule. This dropped with not much notice for the immigration community. There were some rumblings the first a few weeks that they were working on something. My personal opinion is that the government of Canada about 6 months ago opened a program that allowed H-1B workers to automatically apply for Canadian visas. They had 10,000 spots available, and they were directly targeting the U.S. immigration skilled market with H-1 by allowing H-1B employees to then receive work visas in Canada. And they afforded, I think, 10,000 spots for applications.
Yeah,
and
10,000.
Those 10,000 spots got filled up in 3 days.
Oh, 36 hours.
36 hours. Well, forgive me. 36 hours. 10,000 H-1B employees from the United States applied within 36 hours of Canada allowing H-1B employees to secure a work visa in Canada. That, from the contacts that we have at AILA in DC, really caught the attention of the White House. And we think that this modernization rule is as much as the White House can do without having acts of Congress increase the H-1B lottery system or significantly change the requirements for certain visas. I think we are businesses for looking at immigration and how you can strategically use immigration to fill staffing needs. But from a policy perspective, there is the need for some type of a more lenient guest worker program over the long term that would require an act of Congress. So some basics on the rule here. It was released October 23rd. The first part here, and we'll go through these more in depth here following this slide, but they clarified and amended the specialty occupation rule or specialty occupation definition for H-1B purposes. They also clarified when amendments must be filed for third-party placements. They further defined lottery exempt work and lottery subject work, and we'll get into what that means here in a moment. They extended F1 OPT cap gap usage, which is beneficial for employers that have F1 to H-1B programs. They changed the lottery system, or they're proposing to change the lottery system to a beneficiary-centric system, which Matt Meltzer mentioned earlier. We'll get a little bit more into what that means. Unfortunately for consulting companies that locate individuals at third-party sites, the USCIS is now reinstating or proposing to reinstate an MSA statements of work and end client letters for third-party placements. This, combined with filing an H-1B amendment for third-party placement requirement, really means the consulting business might take a hit here in terms of increased immigration costs as a result of these policy changes. And then on the flip side here, positively, they more or less are proposing H-1Bs can be for entrepreneurs, which wasn't quite clear in the past. And as we as a business or a firm are pretty progressive, have not necessarily seen success in that area before. The public comment ends on December 22nd, and we believe that this rule will likely be implemented by March 2024 at the latest, as it includes provisions to change how the H-1B lottery system is done, and the H-1B lottery opens sometime the first or second week in March. Let's move on here. So amending specialty occupation. So the rule proposes to codify existing DHS practices. These are things that the USCIS is already doing in practice in adjudicating petitions, but they're not necessarily codified or under the regulation. So the one things they're doing, they're requiring a direct relationship between the required degree field and the H-1B position. This has always been around, not necessarily in form of law, but as a practice by the USCIS. And what does this mean? If you are going to be a mechanical engineer, you need to have a degree in mechanical engineering or something similar to that. For example, you could be a software engineer and a degree in computer science or software engineering could be a proper preparation for that position. But there has to be, and conversely there, you would say, well, someone that has an English degree or potentially a business administration degree, would they be proper for a financial analyst role or an accountant role? Probably not, because the degrees do not relate closely enough to the positions. And therefore, the position can't be a specialty occupation. At least that's the position the USCIS has always sort of took, not necessarily in law. And as I mentioned before, they do specifically state that a single requirement, the requirement of a degree in a single field does not necessarily mean that the position is not specialty occupation. So what does that mean? You could have multiple degrees that qualify somebody for one type of job. As I mentioned before, someone like a financial analyst may have a degree in accounting or finance or something similar to that, and those would both qualify somebody to be a financial analyst. They did state, or they're proposing that general degree requirements such as business administration, humanities, liberal arts don't necessarily pass that direct relationship. The rationale there is that, business administration teaches students about a bunch of different things, accounting, operations, finance, sales, marketing. It's not specialized enough to, or relates closely enough to one of those positions, because there's an array of different subjects that are taught under the business administration umbrella. Same with humanities. This is just not specific enough to really state, maybe if you were a writer or something like that, and that was the position, and that required a bachelor's degree in humanities, that might be enough of a direct relationship. But for the most part, they're saying it's just too broad of a degree to really qualify someone for a specific career. Lastly, time will tell here whether a master's in business administration would qualify as a specialized degree for management consulting, financial analyst roles. My personal opinion is yes, it would, because it is a master's in business, not just a bachelor's degree, and therefore a heightened, educational level. But we're going to have to see that play out in the adjudication trends at USCIS going forward, if this rule is proposed and ultimately implemented. So next one, H-1B amendment. Now, this is a bit of a larger change. Previously, when you had an individual that was working for a consulting company that was located at an end client site, let's say the company's located in Houston, they've located a resource in Philadelphia because of a contract that the companies have for software development or engineering help or whatever. And then the company in Houston moves that employee from one end client site in Philadelphia to another end client, completely different company. There was a gray area there for a while as to whether an H-1B amendment needed to be filed because it was a move, but it was in the same metropolitan statistical area and therefore might not have required an H-1B amendment to be filed because it's not considered a material change. Here, the USCIS is putting its foot down and saying this is a material change. The Department of Labor several years ago amended their LCA form to include end client naming and sort of sites. So there's information there that the Department of Labor has. This is USAS becoming congruent with that DOL position and saying when a new LCA is filed or a new LCA is, when a person moves end client work sites from one different end client to another, an LCA must be filed and an H-1B must be filed with the USCIS. This had not previously been enforced by the Department of Homeland Security or USCIS, but will be if the rule is ultimately implemented in its current fashion. Next slide, please. Lottery exempt employers versus current non-exempt work. This is getting a little bit into the weeds when it comes to how business or firms like Meltzer Hellrung help clients be creative in staffing H-1B employees. Essentially, when an individual, there are certain types of cap exempt organizations or lottery exempt organizations. These are typically universities, hospitals that have relationships with universities, research, basic or advanced research institutions. And those companies or organizations are lottery exempt. They can file H-1Bs for employees without having to put them through the lottery every year like most private companies do. Well, there was a gap here that essentially that Meltzer Hellrung and other firms were taking advantage of, which is if you have somebody that's been through the lottery a couple of different times, and let's say they don't get selected, unfortunately, after 2 or 3 shots, you could locate that employee at, let's say, a university that close by, having them doing research for that organization, and then concurrently employ the individual part-time again in your business, your private business. So essentially, they'd have 2 jobs. One is exempt and the other one is not exempt. And you were allowed to pursue that structure to maintain the employee's work authorization status, but also perhaps buy another chance at the lottery down the road. So you could get a full-time employee inside of your organization through the lottery, have a cap subject petition that's filed and approved, and then therefore the employee would no longer have to work part-time at a cap exempt organization. What they did here was broaden the number of entities that are considered to be cap exempt, so making it a little bit more likely that you can find one of these organizations to submit an H-1B outside of the lottery and have the employee then work part-time for both organizations. They also, there was a reading or a position taken by the USCIS that the individual would have to be working for the cap exempt organization in a position that furthers the research mission. They're loosening that requirement. And saying basically that cap exempt employers will be determined, and forgive me, they're loosening the requirement on the employee, and then they're further going back to the cap exempt employers and saying that the cap exempt employer will be determined based on whether research is a significant function of the organization and not necessarily the main function. One of the ways of establishing cap exemption is that you are a basic or advanced research institution, and they're saying, well, that if your whole purpose is research, then you're cap exempt. Here they're loosening that requirement and saying that a significant component of your organization has to be research and not necessarily the number one goal. So allowing, again, more entities to essentially qualify for cap exemption. A little bit in the weeds on that one, but it is overall a positive change, proposed change that would allow more individuals and more organizations qualify for cap exemption.
Yep, I agreed, Matt. There's a question here in the Q&A that I think it's worth just answering live because it goes back to a question on the previous slide about whether work experience might still count towards specialty occupation degree requirements. And so the regulation doesn't touch on that at all. And from that, since it doesn't touch on it, I don't think it will change anything about in terms of using work experience to be equated to a specialty occupation degree. The question is really what is the degree, not necessarily how did you get it. So I don't think that it's going to really change anything for those people who've been relying on work experience to get them to a specialty occupation degree.
I agree. Next slide. So F1P, F1 OPT cap gap. So the basis of this is when F1 students are in school after they graduate, they're entitled from either 12 months of OPT work authorization sponsored by the school, or potentially 36 months of OPT work authorization sponsored by the school if they have a STEM degree. Here, what they're saying is a lot of times, because the lottery now is done in several different phases, it used to be that cap gap had to end on October 1st every single year, with the idea that the person's going to have an approved H-1B lottery petition by then and seamlessly transfer from October 31st, September 30th to October 1st from F1 to OPT to H-1B. Well, now because the lottery is being done in successive rounds, they had a lottery in March, they had a lottery in July this year. There doesn't look like there's going to be a third lottery, but the previous year there was a third lottery. What's happening when that happens is these individuals are not applying for their H-1B, submitting their H-1B lottery petitions until September, July, August, September, October sometimes, and their cap gap is ending, it's expiring. So you have an individual that's selected for the H-1B lottery that has a pending petition being processed with USCIS, but their current F1 OPT cap gap ends on October 1st, and now they can't work for you for potentially 1, 2, 3 months until the H-1B lottery petition that was submitted in a second or third lottery is ultimately approved. Well, one, as a firm, we constantly guide clients, use premium processing in these situations. If you have someone that is coming up on their cap gap extension, let's say September, premium process the H-1B lottery application if you can, so you get a quicker decision, so you avoid that loss of work authorization for a small period of time for the individual. But two, the USCIS or DHS is stepping up and saying, yes, we realize this is a problem, and therefore we are going to allow OPT to be extended through April 1st of the following year. Matt, do you mind navigating back to the previous slide? Thank you. So they're extending OPT cap gap to allow the individual to continue to maintain work authorization while their H-1B lottery petition is being processed, and ultimately cutting it off on April 1st of the following year rather than October 1st of the current year. So that's a positive improvement that will help folks that are in this situation as a result of the change in the lottery. Fortunately, it would have been nice if USCIS and DHS thought about this beforehand, but obviously they are reactionary in a lot of their regulation promulgation. So they changed the H-1B lottery. This is something that is happening more and more now as a result of the lottery. And now DHS and USCIS are coming back around and saying, yep, we need to change the OPT cap gap rule and extend it to prevent this from happening as often. It's overall a positive change. The beneficiary-centric H-1B lottery system, we hit the lead here. I know this is what most people are most interested in as we discuss today's webinar. As Matt Meltzer mentioned before, we had 780,000 petitions or submissions submitted last year by thousands of different companies and for thousands of different employees, but only about half of those were for unique one-time individuals. What does that mean? Well, an employee can have several different businesses sponsor them for the H-1B lottery. Each one of those businesses' submission is considered a submission in that 780,000 total. Here, the USCIS is saying, wow, they're essentially pushing back against the multiple submission lottery scheme, where companies will collude together and try to submit as many submissions to game the system for one employee, so that if you have one employee, they have 10 submissions from 10 different companies that are colluding together, it's likely that the employee will be selected in the lottery. The USCIS is recognizing this is happening as a result of a massive increase of H-1B lottery submissions from 2020 to 2023, 2021 to 2023 has consistently gone up, and last year I think it was a 100% increase year over year. So they're now addressing this with a few different provisions. So the beneficiary-centric H-1B lottery system, what does it mean is that an individual can have multiple companies submit H-1B lottery submissions for them, and they should, but the lottery will only take the individual in once as into their lottery system or their lottery pool, such that there can't be 6 or 7 different lottery submissions that are considered when they do the lottery. It's just for one individual. Here they're saying one individual, one submission, although businesses can have several different sponsorships for one individual, that will not increase their chances of the individual getting selected because they're only selecting the individuals now, not the company submissions. That's the major thrust of this rule. They're also extending the prohibition, or proposing to extend the prohibition on related entities filing multiple H-1B petitions, which has always been prohibited, to related entities submitting multiple H-1B registrations for the same individual. This is exactly what we saw happen last year. We had related entities. Let's say you have a conglomerate of 10 different companies. There's a pool of, in those companies, 15 individuals that require H-1B lottery sponsorship. Well, each company of the 10 would submit a lottery submission for all 15 in the pool, therefore, increasing their chances and sort of gaming the system. Here they're saying they're proposing that is they're prohibiting that. And if the USCIS does find out that's happening, and this would likely be through a request for evidence for corporate organizational structure, including equity documents, they will deny the petition. So that's a very big change in the lottery system as a whole, moving to a beneficiary centric. And ultimately, what does this do for businesses? If you've got one submission for one employee, and you know that employee is not getting a bunch of submissions from other different companies, not much. But if that employee is gaming the system and has maybe 5 different companies submit 5 different H-1B lottery submissions, that employee is only taken in the lottery once, then ultimately that employee is selected. The employee has more power because they now hold the selection of the H-1B lottery. And now they would be able to negotiate with all 5 companies as to who would give them the best offer. And ultimately the employee would choose to match their lottery selection with the business that gives them the best offer. So it decreases the number of overall lottery submissions, prohibits multiple related lottery submissions, but it does at the same time give the employee a little bit more power when negotiating with businesses. So I think this is both positive for businesses in that you get more individuals selected, but potentially a small negative here, which is that the selection itself, if the employee is selected, it doesn't necessarily mean that you control the selection. Now the employee does, and they could potentially negotiate with other companies that have made submissions on their behalf to get better job offers versus your company. So we're going to see how this proposal plays out. I do think it's a significant improvement in the lottery system and should lower the number of submissions, increasing the likelihood of individuals being selected in the lottery, likely next year.
I have this one live question here. If a person has multiple job offers, does each employer still need to make a lottery submission?
They do. So yes, under this proposed rule, as we understand it right now, yes.
And the second part is, does the company still bear the cost of the lottery submission?
Yes, the company would still have to bear the cost of the lottery submission. Each one would. In that case, as we understand the proposed rule right now, again, I want to emphasize this is a proposed rule. It's not into effect. There's a comment period for the next 30 or 40 days here, and thereafter the rule may change slightly as a result of comments. But in practice, the rule will likely look pretty much like this. Here we are with another significant change with the proposed rule, which affects consulting companies. Now, consulting companies, as they were in the past, prior to the matter of Simeo decisions, are required to submit master services agreements, statements of work, and end client letters for every single employee that's located permanently or semi-permanently at an end client site. From 2020 to today, you're not necessarily required to submit this information. And now the proposed rule is bringing back this requirement. And I personally think this is a bit of a hit at consulting companies, as the USCIS is looking through the data and dug into it in the H-1B lottery system, and thinks that, I assume that they think that consulting companies are the reason for the rise in H-1B lottery submissions, and therefore are taking measures to, I don't say punish consulting companies, but make it more difficult for consulting companies to, 1, game the H-1B lottery system, and 2, the consulting business has a practice of submitting as many H-1B lottery submissions as you can, and then as a result of 3 months of processing, then securing contracts, MSAs, and work letters later on, or basically securing the bona fide job offer for the submission later on in the season as a result of how corporate contracting works. This is another shot from the USCIS to kind of put a wrench in that scheme and say, when you submit the petition, the transfers, H-1B lottery petitions, anything, you have to have a master services agreement, a statement of work, and an end client letter that are all confirming the job duties of the position, as well as where it's located, and that there's a contractual obligation and relationship between the company that's sponsoring the H-1B and the ultimate end client. Notably, though, one positive here, positive or negative, depending on how your business, consulting business has been using H-1Bs, is that the USCIS will now take into consideration end client requirements for specialty occupation purposes. What does that mean?
I think that's going to be a huge challenge, Matt.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to be hard for many companies to get these layers. We'll see how the end clients work, but if the end client provides incomplete information or bad information, how are companies going to work with their clients, especially if they don't have a direct relationship, to get something that's valuable? I think it's going to be a big wrench in the system. We'll see if it survives the regulatory proposal.
Yeah, the requirement of MSA statements of work and end client letters are going to put a significant burden on consulting companies. I view it in the sense of the positive light would be that if you have a staffing company and you're locating engineers on site at an aviation company, and they're all like aviation or mechanical engineers, you could potentially use the end client's requirements to substantiate the specialty occupation. Whereas before in the consulting model, sometimes the USCIS would issue RFEs and say, you are a consulting company and you don't make engineering or aircrafts or parts or like that. How could you require bachelor's degrees, or how does your internal standard relate to what you do as a business? Here they could say, well, it's not our internal standard, it's our client standard that requires this bachelor's in mechanical engineering or aviation. So we'll see how that plays out, as Matt Matson mentioned, in terms of the comments, and ultimately what will result in the final published rule. We're not sure. We'll have to wait and see here. And here I'm going to throw it over to Matt to talk about one of the more positive aspects of the rule at H-1Bs for entrepreneurs.
Yeah, so I do a lot of work advising entrepreneurs, and this has always been fraught for years. I've never, for entrepreneurs where an H-1B holder wants to have a controlling stake in the company, 50% or more, we typically I've never recommended H-1Bs, or had to have a tough discussion about, are you willing to give up some of your equity, or have an unconventional operating agreement, or board rules that allows the board to fire you from a company that you own, and that's usually not desirable. But this proposal is saying, in theory, this is already in place, but that entrepreneurs who have a controlling stake in the company can get an H-1B, and there is no employer-employee relationship. And so this is a huge boon to individuals on H-1B. It means that you don't necessarily need to go on workarounds of O1 or green cards that are premature, or entrepreneur parole. If you're already on H-1B, you may be able to pursue H-1B as an entrepreneur, even if you have a 50% or more stake in the company. They are changing the validity period for these entrepreneurs, so I'm sure there will be some changes in the form. But if you are in this case, you're going to get an approval for 18 months, followed by a second 18-month approval. I personally think that's absolutely worth the cost of doing business here, to be able to pursue H-1B as opposed to having to pursue something else makes life so much better, especially for nationals that aren't treaty country nationals who get E2s or aren't yet ready for O1s. They are also saying that, the questions about specialty occupation work, where it's also been a challenge of, are you doing administrative work while you're on H-1B? They're going to lessen that and say, clearly someone who is an owner of a company is going to do things that may not be a specialty occupation kind of tasks, things like raising funds or overseeing operations of the company. But if you are still pursuing some of those specialty occupation roles, whether it's software development and writing code, if you are in a financial company and doing financial analysis, if you are an engineer and you're doing engineering work, but you are doing these other functions as the company representative leader, which you would previously had to downplay and pretend you weren't doing, you can be much more honest about it now. So this is, to me, this is one of the best things that Biden administration is making it much easier and clearer for entrepreneurs to pursue entrepreneurship on H-1B. And so if your company has the funds to make a prevailing wage possible for a company leader, the H-1B has become a much better path and a clearer path to success than it ever has been before.
Yeah, and I agree with Matt here. I think this is a bit of a farce. You know, the Biden or the administration said, well, the H-1Bs could always be used for founders, and then as they now are proposing to specifically say they are for founders, they're also removing the employer-employee language relationship that prevented H-1Bs from being approved for founders. Because how can you, if you're a CEO or a founder of an organization, how can you be both an employer and an employee? And that was a seminal requirement in H-1B regulations. Before this proposal removes those requirements, then states further that H-1Bs can be used for entrepreneurs, but the USAS and the DHS are saying, well, this was always possible. So a huge benefit for companies with early stage founders that can be now on H-1B. But I think there's a bit of politicalization here that's going on with the release of the rule. I think that any additional questions that we can answer for this time, I think we're almost right on time, about 1 o'clock. We really appreciate everyone joining us for the content today, the webinar. We moved through pretty quickly. Just want to remind everyone that we will send out to everyone that registered a copy of today's deck, as well as the recording from today's webinar. Here on the screen, you see the contact information for myself and my business partner, Matthew Meltzer. We're always happy to have follow-up conversations about budgeting or this rule. We appreciate everyone's time today, and we hope to see you all soon. Thank you very much.